Let's make a CRUD with minimal APIs. Hello, my name is Felipe Gavilan, and in this video, we're going to learn how to create, read, update and delete data from a database using our web API. For this, we're going to use Entity Framework Core. This is a free course. Nevertheless, if you want to learn more about minimal APIs, buy my Udemy course today. A link with a discount is in the description of this video. Alright, so back to this tutorial. The first thing that I want to do is to install Entity Framework Core in our project. With Entity Framework Core, we have a technology that allows us to increase our productivity when we're dealing with applications that have to work with databases. The idea is that from our C# code, we can create a database, but also we can create tables and interact with that database using simple C# code. For that, we're going to install two NuGet packages. So let's go to the Solution Explorer, right-click on our project, let's click on Manage NuGet Packages, let's go to Browse, and let's say Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server, so this package. Notice that we're going to use EF Core 8, so install, accept, and since we're using Visual Studio, we have to install another package so that we can use the NuGet Package Manager with Entity Framework Core, and that package is Entity Framework Core Tools. Now, if you are not using Visual Studio and instead you are using something like Visual Studio Code, you only have to install this package, Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design. But in our case, since we're going to install Tools, and Tools already installs Design here, as you can see here, then we don't need to install this one, but this one only. So let me click on here, let's click on Install, and let's click on Accept, and we're good to go from here, so let me close this. Now we're going to create a DB context. The DB context is the central piece of Entity Framework Core. It is through this class that we're going to indicate what tables we want to create. So let me create here a folder, right click, add folder, new folder. I'll call it contexts. Some people call it data, but whatever is fine. Context, right click on it, add class. I like to call it application DB context. And we're going to inherit from the DB context class. So DB context control dot, and let's import this namespace control dot again, and let me generate this constructor, the one that says options. So this one, which will allow me to pass the options or configurations, like what database we're going to use, the connection string, and so on, through the constructor of this class. Now we have to create a connection string. The connection string contains the necessary information to access our database. For that, we're going to use a configuration provider, like appsettings.development.json. So let's come to here, appsettings.development.json, and in here, just below this message, we can put connection strings, and in here, we're going to put default connection, whatever name you want to use is fine. What's important here is this part which is the connection string itself. So we're going to say server equal to, by default, when you install Visual Studio, you get an instance of LocalDB. And you can find that here in SQL Server Object Explorer. And if you don't have that here, you can always come to View, SQL Server Object Explorer, and this will open this tab. So let's come here. This is the instance that I want to use. I think I can click on here, rename, copy, and just paste the name here. Or you can use, if you want to, an instance of SQL Server, but just to keep things simple, I will just use LocalDB. Now, semicolon, database, what is going to be the name of our database? It is going to be minimal APIs for YouTube, semicolon, integrated security. What is this integrated security? Well, this means if we want to use username and password to log into our database server, to log into our database, or if we just want to use our Windows credentials. In our case, we want to use our Windows credentials, so we can use true here. Now, finally, I'll say trust server certificate, which basically means that since we are in development, we can relax the security rules. So this is it. This is our connection string. As you can see here, let me put it on a screen so that you can visualize everything better in case you want to copy something from it. And now let's go to the program class. So Solution Explorer, program class. And in here, we're going to configure a service. Remember that we configure services here in this part before this bar up. So here, add services to the container. And we can configure the application DB context as a service. That means that we're going to be able to get an instance of that class from any part of our application. This is because we're going to be using dependency injection. So let me say builder services add DB context. There is a special method for adding DB context to the services container. So add DB context. Here I have to put the name of my class, which is application DB context. Then parentheses, options, and then in here I will say options.use SQL Server, because I want to use SQL Server, and then I can pass the name of the connection string, and I can say for that name default connection. So as you can see, and semicolon here, so as you can see, I'm putting here this default connection, which is this name that we have here, default connection. In this way, we are passing the connection string to our entity framework core, so that the database that we're going to create is going to be named Minimal APIs for YouTube, and it's going to be placed in this server that we have here. With this, we have configured entity framework core. Now we're going to create our first table. The first thing that we need is an entity. An entity refers to a class that is going to represent a table in our database. For that, we're going to create a new folder. So come here, right click on it, on the project, add new folder, entities, right click on it, add class. We're going to create a new class. We'll call it person. So in this person class, we're going to have two properties, which are going to be ID, and the second one is going to be string name. Now, this is going to be a required property, so I want to write here required. So as you may imagine, this entity will represent a table which will have two columns, the ID column and the name column. Alright, so now let's come back to the application DB context class, because we need to indicate that we want to use that person class as a representation of a table. So for that, we come here and we're going to say prop db set person and people. Alright, so what are we doing here? Control dot to bring entities. So we're saying that db set person, this means that we want to create a table based on the information of the person class, and the name of that table is going to be people. Now, of course, we haven't created our database and much less our table, so what do we have to do for that? For that, we can do two things. If you're using Visual Studio, you can come to the Package Manager console, and if you don't have it here, you can always come to Tools, NuGet Package Manager console, or if you are using a tool like Visual Studio Code and you want to use the .NET CLI, you can use the command that I'm putting on the screen right now. In my case, I want to use the commands that are specific for the Package Manager console. So I will write here add migration, and I will just call it people table, for example. Enter. And with this, we have created a migration. But what is a migration? Well, as I mentioned before, we can use Entity Framework Core so that we can create or modify a database. Now, that is a very sensitive operation, so a migration is basically an intermediate step that allows us to see what is going to happen in the database. For example, here we have this up method, which indicates what is going to happen when we actually apply this migration. And this migration, what it's going to do is to create a table. The name of the table is going to be people. It's going to have columns, and those columns are ID, which is going to be of type integer. It is not going to be nullable, and it is going to be an identity, which is seed1, and it will increase in a 1-by-1 manner. And the second column is going to be name. It is going to be of type nvarchar max, and it is not going to be nullable. And then we're going to have a constraint, which in our case is a primary key, which is going to be pk people, that is the name of the primary key. And the column for that primary key is going to be the ID column. Alright, that is good for me. But also, let me show you that we have this down method. We have the up method, which is what is going to happen when we apply the migration. But we also have a down method, which is what is going to happen if we reverse the migration. We can revert a migration. And it is going to drop the table people. That basically means that it's going to delete the people table. So again, a migration is basically an intermediate step in which what is going to happen to the database is going to appear here as code. So we can agree that this is what we wanted to happen. We're going to create a people table with two columns. So let's actually apply this migration to our database. In our case, we don't have a database yet. So when we apply the migration, the database is going to be automatically created. So let's go back to the Package Manager console and we're going to say update database, enter. Alright, so now let's come back to the SQL Server Object Explorer. Let's expand our instance of LocalDB databases, and here we have minimal APIs for YouTube. And in here I can expand, we have tables, and in tables we're going to see that we have the people table, and in the people table we can see that we have columns, and inside of those columns we have the ID column and the name column. And also we have in keys the PK people key, which means that we have a primary key, which is ID, as we can see here, that says PK primary key. Also we can see that we have this very interesting table that is called EF Migrations History. What is this? Well, basically, and let me right click on it and click on View Data. Basically what EF Migrations History does is to save what migrations have been applied to our database. This is basically like a log, a history table that allows us to see which migrations has been applied. For example, we have here that we have the people table migration, which is the migration that we have here. The people table migration has been applied to our database. So that is not pending to be applied. Alright, so let me close this. We can see that in people, right click, view data. In the people table, we don't have any data. Of course, we just created this table. So now let's insert data to it. For that, we can go back to the program class. We're going to create a new endpoint that is going to allow us to insert a person into the table. So let's come down here. We can put this below this message. And let me say app.mapPost. I use mapPost because I want to receive an HTTP post request. And let me say the route, which is going to be /people. Then here, I want to use asynchronous programming. So I will say async. And I will say person. And I need to bring the namespace entities. So entities. Alright. I want to receive an instance of person. This is going to be sent by the client, but also I want to inject an instance of the application DB context. Remember that I said that we were configuring the application DB context as a service, which means that we can use dependency injection to get an instance of that class. Now, how do we use Entity Framework Core to add a record to a database? So for that, we're going to say context. We're going to use our application DB context. I'm going to say .add, and I'm going to add the person. Alright, so this is not enough to add the person to the people table. We need to say await context save changes async. Now with this, we are actually adding or inserting the person into the corresponding table. Now, how does this work? Well, basically what we did here was to mark this person with an status that says added, which means that we want to add that person into the database. It's just like when you work with Excel or when you work with Microsoft Word, when you make a change to the document, but you don't save the changes. So we're making a change in a sense, but we haven't saved those changes. When we do this command here, when we execute this line of code, then we are saving the pending changes into the database. So we said that we want to add this, but we haven't done it yet. But when we do save changes, we actually go to the database and insert this person. Now, after that, we're going to return something. So we will return typed results.ok. In real life, we should return a 201 created, but we're going to do that in a few minutes. For now, let's just return a 200 OK. Now, in order to test this endpoint, I want to use our HTTP file. So let's go to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to Minimal APIs YouTube ENG HTTP. Now let's come here. Let me create here a title like person create. And I want to say post. I will put this variable here /people. I will use a content type, which is going to be application JSON. Make sure to write it correctly. And then I will leave one space here. And then in here, I will put the properties of my entity here. So we have here person, which has a name. So I will put here, and I'm going to put here name. And the name is going to be Felipe. Alright, now with this we can test. Let me click on send request. Let's wait a few seconds. If you get this error, then it means that you are not running your application. So Ctrl F5. We forgot to do Ctrl F5 to actually run our application. Now the application is running. You can see that from the console. That's open. Alright, great. Now send request one more time. Now as we can see, we're getting a 500 server error, and it says the error says that an unhandled session was thrown by the application, a name connection string was used, but the name default connection was not found. Alright, so how do we debug this? Alright, so let's see that indeed we have this here, we have default connection, but what may be happening is that in properties, in log settings, we are using here, as you can see, production. This should be development, so development. Alright, so we should be good to go. Now let me press Ctrl F5 one more time. Let me come back to the HTTP file. Alright, so send request. Okay, so 200 okay, excellent. So now let's come here to the people data. Let me refresh, and let's see that now we have ID 1. Notice that that was automatic, and name Felipe. Excellent. Let me create another person like Claudia. So Claudia. Alright, so send request. That was very fast. So let's come back here, and as you can see, we have Claudia now. Now that we have data in our database, I want to create two endpoints to visualize that data. So let's come back to the program class. Let me close this. We have so many things open. So let me close a few things that we don't need anymore. Now let's come back to the endpoints part of our program class, and let's come here. I like to put the gets first. So app map get, because we want to get information. So people slash comma async. We just need the application DB context, which we're going to get using dependency injection. So context, alright, semicolon, bar people equal to await context people to list async. What are we doing here? So we're saying that we want to go to the context, we want to go to the people table, and we want to get all of the people, all of the records, and put it in a list. And we put that list in this people variable. And then after that, we're going to say return type results.ok people, semicolon here. Now let's test this endpoint. So let's come back here. It is going to be similar to this one. So I will just copy this and paste it here. Get all, but it's going to be a get request to this URL. But instead of content type, we want to use accept, because we're talking about the data that we're expecting back from the server. Now let me click on send request. It says method not allowed because I have to Ctrl+Shift+V to recompile my application. One more time. Alright, so now we have 200 OK, Felipe, and Claudia. So this is working. But sometimes we don't want to get all of the people. We may only want to get a few of them. For example, for that we can use an endpoint to get them by their ID. So let's come back to the program class and let's create that. So let's come back here, app map get slash people slash, and we want to use here a parameter, a route parameter. So for that we use squiggly brackets, and then we say ID, which is going to be the name of the parameter, and then we can use here the data type of that parameter, which is going to be integer. But please notice that we use this restriction here for data types like int. We don't use it, for example, for strings, just so that you don't get that error in the future. Do not do this, but instead, if it is an integer, for example, then you can use the data type here. Alright, so comma, async task, and we're going to get from this endpoint two kind of results, because we can get the person or we can get a 404 in case we send the ID of a non-existing person. So for that we say results, because there are several kinds of results that we can receive from this endpoint, and then we want to say OK of person and OK of person, and let me come here, Control dot, to bring this namespace HTTP results, and then after this, I want to say comma, not found. Alright, so after this, I want to put my parameter, so ID. Notice that this ID coincides with this ID that I have here, comma, application DB context in lowercase. Now this and this. Now, before I continue, let me show you something, and that is, what is this that we have here? So this is a route parameter, so if I say people slash 5, for example, this 5 is going to be here, and that 5 is going to be assigned to this variable that we have here. Or if we have a 7 here then the same. We're going to have /people/7. This is going to be the URL, and that 7 is going to be assigned to this ID variable that we have here. That is a way for us to get data from the user in a GET request, so that they specify what person they want to get their information. Alright, so now let's come back here. Let's say var person. I want to get from the database a person according to their ID. So for that, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to say context people dot first or default async, and I'm going to say p. This is a variable name. You can use whatever name you want. So p dot id equal to id. What is this? What are we doing here? What we're doing here is that we're saying that this p represents a record in a database, and with this we're saying that I want the first record that has the following characteristic, and that is that its ID is equal to the ID that we're getting here. For example, it could be 7, for example. I want to get the first record that has this characteristic that we have here, that its ID is equal to this ID parameter that we have here. Now we're saying first or default. This means that either we're going to get the first record that actually matches with, for example, ID 7, and if there are no records with ID 7, then we're going to get a default value for person. Since person is a reference type, the default value is null, because the default value of any reference type, like a class for example, is null. So if person is null, then it means that we try to get a person with a non-existing ID. Then if it is null, then we're going to return not found. So return typed results not found. Alright, 404. Great. Now after that, if we are here, then it means that person was not null, and therefore we found a person, which means that I can say return typed results okay person, semicolon here. Alright, so now we can test this endpoint. So let's come back and let me Ctrl+Shift+B, but let's see that we have an error here. We are missing a parenthesis here. That is fine, that is fixed. Alright, so again, Ctrl+Shift+B, so that we can compile our application and then we can test our new endpoint. So let's come here. Let me repeat this. Get by ID existing. I'll say existing because I want to make two examples, one for an existing person and another one for a non-existing person, so that we can test the 200 OK and the 404 response. So we know from our table that we have ID 1 and 2. I can choose whichever one we want. So for example 1, let me send request, and let's see that we get back a no connection. So Ctrl F5. Let's make sure that we're running our application. This is normal. We can see that in our console the application is running. So again, get by ID, send request. Alright, so Felipe, and if we say 2, send request, Claudia. Excellent. Now let's test the 404. So get by ID, non-existing. I know that we don't have a -2 person, so send request, and we have a 404 back. So our endpoint is working. Now that we have an endpoint, in order to get a person by its ID, we have to come back to the program class and we have to fix our map_post method, because remember that we said that we want to return a created response, but the created response has the characteristic that we have to specify in which URL we can get the information of the newly created record. So for that we needed to create first this endpoint that we have here. Alright, so what I will do first is that I will come here and I will give a name to this endpoint that we have here, so that we can reference this endpoint by name. So with name, look how easy it is, with name, get person. Alright, so this endpoint is called get person. So now I can come here and instead of returning OK, I will say created at route, and I will pass the person that we created, and I will pass the name of the route from which we can get the information of the person, which is get person, and we need to pass the ID of the person, of course, because I need to pass here, for example, 7 or 3 or whatever, in order to get the information of the specific person that I have created in this endpoint. So I will say ID equal to person.person.id, semicolon here. So what we're saying here is that we're going to return the URL for specifically executing this endpoint to get the information of the newly created person. Alright, so now we can test. So Control F5, one more time. Let's come back here. Let me go to create here. Let me create, for example, Robert. So let me send request. And let's see that we have a 201 created. As you can see, it is a new HTTP status code. And we also have, as a response, Robert and its ID 3. But also, if we go to headers, we're going to see that here we have location. And in this location, we have localhost 7019 people 3. And if I come here and I copy this, let's just say as an example that I want to come to a browser like Google Chrome and I want to paste that here, you are going to see that indeed we get back the information of Robert, as you can see here. So in this location URL that we have here, we can get the full information of the newly created record, in this case of Robert. Now let's work with updating people. For that we have to use a pod. So let's come to the program class and let's create a new endpoint. So let's say app map put and let's say /people/ and we want to use a route parameter again because I want to update a specific person and I need its ID in order to update the record. So async task results, because I want to be able to return actually 3 kinds of results. A bad request, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, a string, a not found, and a no content. Alright, so let's see what we got here. Let me put this here, and I need a few parameters, so let me put this in another line so that you can visualize everything better. So the parameters are going to be the ID that we have here, of course. Then we need the person that we want to update, so person. And then I want the instance of the application DB context class so that we can interact with our database. So context in lowercase. Alright, so this should be fine. Hopefully this is fine. Alright, so the first thing that I want to see is that since person can bring an ID and we have an ID here, I want to see that those IDs match. We can fix this by using a DTO, but we're not going to be talking about DTOs in this video, so we're just going to say if ID, this ID that corresponds with this ID, of course, is different than person ID. That is, if we have one ID here and another ID inside of this person, then we're going to return an error. And when we return an error that is caused by something that the user did wrong, we can return a bad request, a 400 bad request. So we're going to say return typed results dot bad request. The IDs do not match. Alright. Now after that, we can verify the existence of the person. So for that, we can use a method. So we're going to say exists equal to await context. Again, we're going to use the DB context. So people any async. What is this any async? What any does is to verify the existence of a record that has a specific characteristic. In our case, as you may imagine, we want to check if there is a record in the people table that has the property ID equal to the ID that we're receiving here in this parameter. If that is the case, we're going to get true. If that is not the case, we're going to get back false. What is the difference between any async and first or default async? Well, that this first or default, if the record exists, is going to bring the record, is going to fetch the data of the record. But in our case here, we only want to make sure if it exists or not. We don't want to fetch its data so it is faster. We just want to check if it exists. So we're going to say here, if it doesn't exist, so negation, we're going to say return typed results not found. Alright. And finally, we want to update the record. So for that, we can use context update person. This is the same as we did with add. Remember that here we did add, but that doesn't actually add the record in the database, but mark it as to be added when we save changes. The same logic applies here. we are marking this person as to be updated, but we need to actually save changes in order for that change to be reflected back into the database. Alright, so await context save changes async. Alright, and now finally we return a type results, no content. This means that everything was okay, but we don't want to return anything. This is similar to just returning a 200 OK without anything, but it is standardized to actually use 204 in these scenarios. But OK or no content, both are just fine. Alright, so let's test this. Let me press Ctrl F5 to make sure that we have our application up and running. And let's come here, and I want to use a put, which is very similar to this one. So I will just copy it and paste it and say here update. Alright, so we have a put. Remember that we are going to use a put. That is why we said here map put. Alright, so the URL, people, the ID. For example, let's say that I want to update Felipe, which is of ID 1, content type application JSON. Here I need to put its ID. So 1, comma. Now I will put Felipe updated. So let's see that here in Felipe, and let me update or refresh. We have Felipe here, right? Now, its name is going to be Felipe updated. So let me send request. 204 no content. Alright, that is successful. So let's come back here and let me refresh. And let's see that we have Felipe updated. Excellent. Now, let's just make sure that the other scenarios work. So let's say here works. And let me say here, but request IDs do not match. So if I have here 1 and here 2, we're going to get a 400 bar request. The IDs do not match. And again, let me do the same, but in this case, I just want to check that we have a not found. So for example, let's say -1 and -1 here, -1. Alright, so send request, 404 was not found. Now finally, let's learn how to delete a record. So for that, let's come back to the program class. And let's come back here, and let's say app map delete. We're going to use map delete for deleting. So the route is going to be people / again the ID, because we want to delete a specific record. So int here, async task. Again, we can have several kinds of results. For example, we can have a not found, or we can have a no content. Alright, so one more of this, int ID. Application, and let me put this in another line, application db context, and let me put this here, semicolon, bar deleted records equal to await context. In order to delete a record, we do the following. We say people.where, we're going to use a filter, because I want to get all of the records that have the following characteristic, that is, that they are of ID equal to ID. So I want to get all of the records that have their ID equal to this ID that we have here, and then I want to delete all of those records. So execute delete async. Alright, now this will return the number of records that were deleted. Now, if deleted records is equal to 0, then no record was deleted. Why? Well, because they were not found. So return typed results dot not found. And if we get here, if we get to this part, then it means that at least one record was deleted, and therefore we can say type results dot no content. Then we can test this. Alright, so let's come back to the HTTP file, and I can just copy this just to save some time. So delete works, a delete that works. So here we're going to say delete here. Let me press Ctrl F5 just to make sure that everything is up and running. And I want to delete, for example, Robert. So we have Robert here in 3. So let's delete Robert. So send request. And you can see that we have a 204. And now if we refresh here, we don't have Robert anymore. And of course, if we click on here again, of course, we get back a 404 because there are no more records with ID 3 in the people table. Alright, so as you can see, we were able to implement a CRUD using Entity Framework Core. If you want to learn more about minimal APIs with Entity Framework Core, buy my Udemy course today. There is a link with a discount in the description of this video. Thank you.